All right, today we're going to go through the timeline of major environmental events that have occurred. Important for a couple of reasons. Number one, we need to learn from the past. We don't want to keep repeating the same errors, and we need to understand where a lot of our environmental laws and legislation came from. It's also important because this will be on any AP or IB exam you take. There will be at least one, if not two, historical events, and if they don't question you about the event specifically, you can bring that event into your answer and just prove your knowledge. This is one of the ways that you can say, look, I'm really versed in environmental science. Um, Great quote by a Native American, Chief Seattle in 1855. He said, whatever befalls the earth befalls the sons of earth. And again, that's the idea that what we do now impacts the future. And that's really important when we look at environmental issues. What we're doing today, as far as our carbon dioxide output, will affect the future of the earth. The environmental movement is based on events that cause concern over environmental impacts. So something bad happens, some disaster occurs, and we get this groundswell of environmentalists or people who are concerned about the environment or people that were impacted, and they come together to then force legislation, force laws, force change. It elicits response from individuals, groups of individuals, governments, and United Nations. What we need to realize on this United Nations front is that there's no border that goes up into the atmosphere or that separates our oceans. And so we cannot look at an environmental issue country by country. We have to realize that whatever we do in our country will affect other countries and vice versa. Often we see conflict between groups that see reasons for conserving nature as a way to continue to supply goods and service to humankind in a sustainable way. So those groups that want to log in a sustainable way, even if it's detrimental to the economy, and those that see the reason for conserving nature unconditionally for its spiritual value. So we have the group that says, look, we have a way that we can still harvest goods from the environment, but do it in a way that maybe isn't as impactful to the environment as it used to, that we can do it in an environmentally conscious manner. There's also groups out there that are 100% against impacting nature at all. When you go 100%, we're not going to impact nature at all, the problem you have with that is that then you impact the economy and you negatively impact people. And we have to see some balance between that. All of this environmental movement legislation, it's going to influence norms of behavior. I'm sitting here right now over summer with my reusable cup and my reusable straw drinking my tea. Whereas 5 years ago, I'd have a paper cup and a paper or a plastic straw. So we've changed the norms of behavior. We started saying, you know what? You're not a great person if you're using disposable things all the time. It's going to influence our economic choices. We vote a lot with our dollar. So a while ago, it came out that Arrowhead Water was getting water in a national forest without a permit and selling that to consumers. And it was a time when California was in a horrible drought. And so we voted with our dollar. People stopped buying Arrowhead. And it also influences our political choices. We hopefully look at the people that are running for office, we look at their environmental policies and ideas, and we put people into office that support environmental policies and ideas that align with our personal policies and ideas. The idea of a precautionary principle is something that states we're not going to do an action, we're not going to put a law into place until we know that that law is going to have the intended outcome. So it states, by definition, the precautionary principle or precautionary approach states that if an action or policy has a suspected risk of causing harm to the public or to the environment, in the absence of scientific consensus that the action or policy is not harmful, the burden of proof that it is not harmful falls on those taking the action that may or may not be at risk. That's convoluted. It's hard to understand, but let's put it this way. Jerry Brown enacted a cow fart tax, essentially a tax on cows because we know that methane is a major greenhouse gas. And that negatively impacted all of our cattle farmers in the region. It hurt their, economy. They had to either pay this tax out of their profits or they had to get rid of their cows. Well, let's think about that cow fart tax. So, cows fart, methane goes up into the environment. And is there anything that's going to divide the atmosphere of California from Arizona or Nevada? No. So, that methane goes up in the atmosphere, impacts the entire globe. Well, if you're a cow farmer and you can't afford to run your cattle operation here in California, you're going to go into Nevada or Arizona where land is cheap and you're going to run your cattle operation. The cows are still farting, the same amount of methane is still going up into the atmosphere because none of us are going to stop eating in and out. And so we really didn't reduce the methane. But what we did do is now increase transportation because now I have to get that hamburger back into California for the people that want to eat it, as opposed to it being locally grown. And so precautionary principle says that that tax should have never been enacted because it's going to cause more harm than it solved. President Obama had a great quote here on the precautionary principle. He says, "We face two paths. One path consists of our failure to act to prevent climate change. It leads to utter destruction of all things that are good. The other path consists of our acting to prevent climate change through draconian regulation. It leads to abject human misery. I pray we have the wisdom to choose between them." Here's where I differ from Obama a little bit. I don't think we have to choose between them. I think we have to find a middle ground. I think we have to find some middle ground between eliminating what's causing our climate change and still allowing the economics and the economy to function. All right, the people involved in this. Individuals that are influential, individuals that have a voice in an audience. Leonardo DiCaprio is famous for this. He gets up at the Oscars and he talks about climate change. They are not necessarily experts. Hopefully they listen to experts and are informed on their decision, but they can influence you guys. Independent pressure groups use awareness campaigns to affect change, and they influence the public, who then influences politicians with their voting. We consider these NGOs or non-government organizations. Greenpeace is one of these. We have corporate businesses that use resources and create environmental impact. They supply consumer demands. We have multinational corporations like Coke and transnational corporations like Walmart that are a little bit on the smaller scale. Governments are huge in here. They're going to make decisions and they're going to apply legislation. They're going to meet with other governments and consider environmental change. And then we have intergovernmental bodies. Again, we cannot do this on a country by country basis. We have to do this as an entire world. And so they are going to discuss global issues and come to understandings. And they're going to bring together a bunch of non-governmental organizations, international governments, and corporations together. All of our climate talks are part of this intergovernmental body. Okay, major environmental events. About 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, agriculture begins. We start now having an impact on our environment. Before this time, we were nomadic. We were no more influential on any environment than, say, a bear was with our hunting and gathering. But at 10,000 to 12,000 years, we found that it was easier to set up a farm and to have animals in captivity and to grow our own plants and our animals. And at that point, we settled down and we started to have an impact on the environment because we weren't moving. So all of our trash was in the same area and we were cutting down trees in the same area instead of spreading that out. Swidden at that time begins, and swidden is defined as clearing the land and slashing and burning. So you cut down all the trees, you burn that, and the nutrients go back into the soil and it allows for agriculture. In 1870, we see our first wildlife refuge as Lake Merritt, California. It's right outside the city of Oakland in Northern California, and it is a marsh with a lot of migratory birds. We set aside that land, and it continues to be a place for migratory birds to rest as they move north to south and south to north. You can see it right outside the city skyline. In 1880, we had the first killer fog event. Remember that anything that's a different color and underlined is a hyperlink, and I entirely encourage you to watch these videos because they go more in depth on how this happened. It's going to help you with your note taking and answering your questions. But the killer fog, we were using in London coal to heat our homes, and the coal dust and the sulfur dioxide that was created through burning that coal for heat mixed in with fog that was sitting low on the city. And so this stuff that would normally escape high into the atmosphere was held low to the ground where people were breathing it in. and within about 3 days, 11,000 people perished. It caused the city of London to switch to burning wood. That eliminated the sulfur dioxide, but we still had this happen again in 1950 as we were using coal in our industrial factories. By the way, that switch to wood kind of saved lives as far as you weren't breathing that in, but it led to deforestation around the city of London. In 1892, we see the Sierra Club form, and when we talk about like huge guys, environmental motions in the United States, a lot of them were out here in the West and looking at Yosemite. John Muir was one of those guys, and that quote up there says, "The mountains are calling and I must go." He was in Yosemite Valley at the time. He saw the wonder of the land and founded the Sierra Club. This is a grassroots environmental activist group that you can join, and it promotes increased preservation of public lands. And so when you pay your membership fee, it goes to preserving land and kind of maintaining that land. 2.4 million members and supporters with 64 local chapters, and they so far have protected 250 million acres. Most of that is out west, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. In 1902, we had the Reclamation Act, also known as the Newland Act. This was a way to claim the western part of the United States. And so back in this time, in the early 90s, late 1800s, we still had some conflict about who owned the western states, whether it be Mexico or Russia or whoever. And the idea was if your citizens were living there, you could lay claim to that land. And so it promoted irrigation and water development projects to bring water out to the arid West so that then you could have a homestead and you could have a farm. It encouraged settlement and development for agriculture. Most of the West rivers were dammed and this water was sold. And if your family farm dates back to 1902, you are getting water on the penny. Now, if you have a new farm, that same water that your neighbor is getting for pennies, you are paying thousands of dollars for. So you really wanted to be kind of grandfathered into this Newland Act. In 1905, we had two societies form. One was the Audubon Society. It was founded by private citizens, and it's basically bird watchers. So they're out preserving land so that they could have birds that they can look at. There's huge citizen science in this. Around Christmas time, they do the Christmas backyard bird count, where you go in your backyard and you record all the birds you see. And this way we get an idea of what species are kind of floundering and need protection. In 1905, we also had the U.S. Forest Service created by Gifford Pinchot. He was, again, like Muir, what we call a grandfather of the environmental movement. Multifaceted agency, protects 154 national forests, 20 grasslands, and covers 44 of our states. So anytime that you go up into the mountains or into your desert and you see that plaque there, all of the Forest Service lands have that same kind of emblem as you enter them. Their mission is to sustain the health, diversity, productivity of the nation's forests and grasslands to meet future and present needs. In 1908, we have the first mention of climate change. So Svante Arrhenius, a Swedish chemist, said, wow, all of this carbon dioxide is creating climate change. And no one listened to him. It wasn't until the 90s, really, that we went, ooh, we have an issue here that we need to fix. But this was the first guy in 1908 that mentioned global warming. And if we had listened to him in 1908, we wouldn't have reached a tipping point, probably. In 1923, the Hetch Hetchy Valley was dammed. This was a controversial moment. It actually led to a fistfight between Pinchot and Muir on whether or not they should do it. And it flooded a valley in Yosemite Park. It now provides water for San Francisco. And you can see what it looked like before and after. And that valley word that's underlined on this slide, that's a video talking about what this area looked like. In 1930s, right around the time of the Great Depression, we also had the Dust Bowl. And so you had poor farming techniques in an area prone to drought with prolonged drought. And essentially the ground became infertile, and all of the wind that then blew across the plains picked up all of the topsoil and spread it into huge dust storms that you see. There used to be a book that you would read in your probably 11th grade year called The Grapes of Wrath, talking about the Okies, the people that were displaced during the Depression and the Great Dust Bowl, and they moved to California to pick grapes. We see loss of farms, jobs, and again, impacted with the Great Depression. In 1933, we were in the middle of the Great Depression, and we needed to put people to work. And so we came up with the Civilian Conservation Corps, which put Americans back into the labor force, but this labor force was now designed to do infrastructure. So all of the highways pretty much that you drive on were built by the CCC, or the Civilian Conservation Corps. Most of our dams were built during this time as well. It planted an estimated 3 billion trees during its time, and it also constructed the Hoover Dam. By the way, if you think about the fact that most of our infrastructure was built in 1933, it also explains why most of our infrastructure is crumbling today. In 1937, we have the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. It goes by FIFRA. This is now going to kind of protect consumers. Before, you could sell anything you wanted and make any claim about it. Now the FDA comes in and evaluates those claims and evaluates the safety of the chemicals that you have underneath your sink. In 1956, we figured out this idea of methyl mercury. Mercury is used, it's a heavy metal, and it's used in gold mining and manufacturing. And when it's ingested, it causes neurological problems. So loss of hearing, speech, coordination, insanity. The idea of the Mad Hatter. They used to use mercury to get the felt soft so they could make hats. And all of the hatters would go mad because they were constantly around mercury. In 1956, a fishing village in Japan had huge amounts of neurological issues, and they linked it to the fact that the methyl mercury was bioaccumulating in the fish that these fishermen were eating, and that we needed to kind of fix this problem. In 1957, the Price-Anderson Act was enacted. We needed a source of power, and we figured out that nuclear power was a pretty clean source of energy, but we also knew that when nuclear power went wrong, it went terribly wrong. And so in 1957, the Price-Anderson Act basically absolved the power plants and the power companies from any lawsuits from the public should there be a nuclear meltdown. This encouraged the development of nuclear power plants and nuclear technology. The Delaney Clause of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act in 1958 prohibited additives to food that have been proven to cause cancer. Like, this is a good one, right? If we know that something causes cancer, we probably don't want it in our Fruit Loops. 1962, Silent Spring was written by Rachel Carlson, an influential book that if you ever go on to study environmental science in college, you'll have to read. But it talks about the bioaccumulation of DDT, which was an amazing pesticide. But this is what got DDT banned, essentially. When we talk about DDT and the precautionary principle, DDT was killing off all of our huge predatory birds like the California condor. It made their eggs really weak, and so mama bird sat on the egg, mama bird squished the baby, and now we lose our big predatory birds like the California condor and the American eagle. The problem is that DDT is one of the only things that is really effective against mosquitoes, and mosquitoes carry malaria. And right now, 3.2 million people live in an area at risk of malaria. It's also the reason why we have bed bugs back. In 1963, we had CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wildlife, Flora, and Fauna. CITES is huge. It will be on every test you take, probably. And it basically prohibits the movement of organisms across state lines or international lines if they've been put on one of the three lists. It works in conjunction with the U.S. Endangered Species Act. In 1969, the National Environmental Policy Act, which says that if you're going to build something, you have to have an environmental kind of evaluation of the area. You have to have an impact. What is this going to do? If I build the toll road through behind Tesoro High School, what will that do to the animals that live there? What will that do to the air pollution in that area? So in 1969, we have to look at decision making. In 1970, we have the Resources Conservation and Recovery Act. It started the recycling movement. It encouraged waste reduction and deals on solid waste. And it gave the EPA the responsibility of providing funds to help states deal responsibly with their waste. 1973 Endangered Species Act comes along. Again, it followed on the heels of CITES, and it set aside funds to protect endangered species. It outlaws the international trade in those species. That includes products of those species like ivy. 1974 Safe Drinking Water Act. Set a standard for safe drinking water, limits what chemicals, metals, and bacteria can be in the water that you drink, and provides financial and technical programs to the states to ensure that you are getting safe drinking water. By the way, not everyone in this country has access to safe drinking water, and we'll see that when we get to our water unit. But those entities that are providing unsafe water or that are polluting our drinking water can be fined through this Safe Drinking Water Act. 1976 Conservation and Recovery Act of our resources. It basically says if you make a chemical or a product, you are responsible for that product through its use and its disposal. It also regulated the transport, and so when you see that stuff on the back of trucks, that tells you what's in the truck as far as a hazardous waste material, and it regulates how we get rid of hazardous waste. 1977 is the Clean Water Act. So now it's not just drinking water that we're concerned with, it's any body of water in the United States. It's also going to strengthen our drinking water regulations, because where do you think we get our drinking water? And states retain water rates and regulate their use through permits. And so this is where we get in a battle with Nevada and Arizona over the Colorado River, is who gets the bulk of that water. Love Canal. Here is our first environmental disaster, and actually I'm going to put that on a second video. So timeline up to the disasters, and then we'll have a full disaster video here soon.